We are on.
So we are on the YouTube. It didn't show nothing yet.
Are
In my
you waiting for me to show something, or are you going to do something
on
first?
YouTube it didn't good night. We are leaving. We are leaving. Hello, people. Good morning. Opa, sorry. Good night.
What? It's not. I see myself on there, even though I'm not on there anymore.
I, s- I mean, I'm looking you on YouTube. Hello, people. We are developers BR. Today we are with Julian. Julie is a famous people. I saw your biography on about me. You are a famous people. We have a very satisfaction receive you here. Thank you so much. That you receive us. Um, I'm a fan of you.
Me too.
I will tell you something about Julie. Wait a minute.
I'm going to turn off my.
Julie, are you ready?
Yes, I'm turning off my camera
Okay.
because it's confusing.
Okay.
And so I just want to say, well, first of all, hello, everybody. I'm being a little confused because what I'm seeing on YouTube is about 5 seconds beyond the reality. So I'm confused. I want to see. Am I sharing my screen? I don't see it on YouTube. Do you see my screen?
Now I didn't see you or your presentation shows a profile icon.
Okay, so I have to go back to Google Hangouts
Yes.
and share the screen again.
Yes.
Aha. Well, my screen is doing something
It's
extremely strange.
It's loading. Yes. Now I'm seeing your
Okay,
presentation.
now I want to.
Yes. Thank
Okay,
you.
I don't see it yet.
Yes. We are looking on YouTube. That's okay.
Okay, so the problem is it seems that the audio is happening quite like 5 seconds sooner than the video. Is that correct? So, for example, I'm moving my mouse. I can see it on my screen, but on YouTube, my mouse is not moving yet. Now it's starting to move. Is that the same for you?
Yes, yes. But because on YouTube you have a delay about 5 seconds.
Okay.
Okay, no problem.
Well, that's
For
important
us,
for me to know.
Julie, for us, not problem for us.
Yes, but if I'm looking at something and talking about it, but you don't see what I'm talking about yet, it's good for me to know.
Okay.
So I'll wait till I see it on YouTube before I do something. Okay.
Okay, no problem.
All right. So it's just this combination is new to me. And the other funny part is we actually tested this today and everything was fine. And then when we tried it tonight, it was all chaos. So I'm sorry. So let's start again. Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be doing this, although, of course, I would be really happy to be there in Sao Paulo. But I'm home in Vermont where it's supposed to be summertime, but instead it's cold and raining. But I have been to Sao Paulo. It's so beautiful, and I still have my visa. It's good for 7 more years, so I'm sure to come back soon, I hope. So what I wanted to talk about tonight when Nane invited me was I want to talk about Docker, but my goal is to help people who really are maybe a little confused about Docker, like I was for so long, and help you just have what I call your aha moment. Oh, okay, now I get it. Now I understand. So that if you have that moment, then it'll be possible for you to really start taking advantage of it and benefiting from it. And the way I want to share that with you is in the same way that I learned it myself. So the very first time I had my exciting moment with Docker, it was when SQL Server became available for Docker, and I tried running it. And this is how I felt when I first saw SQL Server running in Docker. So I'm hoping that you just saw the crazy guy from a funny TV show in the US. Just very shocked. I couldn't believe it. And I'll start by showing that to you in real life. So I'm trying to make sure that I don't talk too quickly because unfortunately I only speak English, but also because I understand now that there's this delay with the YouTube. So I'm going to clear my screen. I'm working on a MacBook. Okay, now I have to wait for it to come up. I've been looking at this terminal screen for about 10 seconds now. That's how long the delay seems to be, 10 seconds. So I'm working on a MacBook. Oh, if I show you the proof, that's going to take another 10 seconds to show you the proof. So you'll see that momentarily. So I'm working on a MacBook, but you know, some of the commands, there's my MacBook just as proof that I'm not working in Windows. And I do have Docker installed. Actually, if I the 10-second delay, at least I can see what it is. Okay, so do you see, if you look up on the right-hand side at the top, there's a little whale icon. That's the Docker icon. So Docker is already running on my machine. And I already have the ability to show you the SQL Server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a SQL Server instance. So I understand you might not even know what's happening yet, but I just wanted you to see how quickly it is to get an instance of SQL Server running on my machine. That means installing it and starting it up. So in its own Docker container. So Docker run, and this is the command. Well, I'll show you it a little more later, but this is just installing it and running it. And oh, I have to give it a new name because I already have another one running. I'm choosing a port. Oh, and it's all the 10-second delay is a little complicated for me to show you things. So I'll do my best here. Okay, so I'm going to run it now. And in my world, the response came back in about 1 second, okay? So that means SQL Server just got installed on my machine. And I didn't really run through the installation. What I was doing was starting up a container that already has SQL Server installed on it. And I can also interact with that container. So I started that one on port 1602. So you can't see what I'm doing. You'll see in a moment. I'm opening up Azure Data Studio, and I'm just going to wait and talk while you can see it. Okay. So I'm going to point to this local host 1602, which is the one I just started up. You'll see this in a minute. I already typed it. Okay. And the username is always SA. So I'm typing that in. You'll see that pop up in a moment, 10 seconds. And the password that I gave to it, which I'm not typing very well. Okay, so I typed the password. And now I'm going to connect. And in real time, this all happens much more quickly, but I'm trying to make up for this 10-second delay. I don't know if the delay is voice and video, but hopefully it's not too crazy. So you can see now there's the database server that I just created, that I just ran. It didn't exist before. So this entire instance of SQL Server, it was really available. The container was ready in about 1 second. After the container started, then it ran some SQL script to make it install system files and master file and things like that. And that usually takes about another 25 seconds. But also notice I have 2 instances of SQL Server running here. Both of them are running on top of Docker. So I just wanted you to see quickly first why the thing that helped me start understanding Docker. It was when SQL Server became available as a in Docker, in a container, and I started using SQL Server on my Macintosh. Now, it's also SQL Server for Linux because Linux can run in Docker. So it's SQL Server for Linux. Microsoft created that. Then they were able to share it in containers, and then we can have these containers now on my Mac. But it's not installed directly on my Mac. And that's what I'm going to start showing you now. I'm going to go back to the slides. And I'm going to wait for the slide to come up. Nane and others, am I right that my voice is happening a lot before the screen?
I think that is normal. I can see the slide now.
Right, but if I don't know how it's syncing, because if I
Yes, the typing sound and the input change are synced. The people from the message on YouTube.
oh, okay. So my voice, so I can just work normally. I don't have to stop and wait.
No, it's perfect.
Okay, then I'm going to not look at it on YouTube because then that's confusing to me. Then I'll just go. So what I just showed you was SQL Server running in something called a container. Okay, and Docker is an application that lets you run containers. So what is a container? A container has an application such as SQL Server and all the resources that SQL Server needs, and they're all packaged into a self-contained execution environment. And you've probably seen this image of a ship with containers on it all the time. And we'll look at that again shortly. This is the most confusing thing, I think, about containers. And I had a really, really hard time understanding it because so many of us are used to working with virtual machines. And at first, the first time you see it, or the first many times you see it, I think, it looks and feels a lot like a virtual machine, right? Because it's self-contained. but it really isn't a virtual machine. If you think about a virtual machine, not only does it have an application inside of it and the libraries that you need to run the application, but the virtual machine also has an operating system, right? We have to create a new virtual machine, and then the first thing you have to do is install an operating system, and then you can install all your other stuff. So there's a lot of work to creating a virtual machine. And then the virtual machine, that sits on your computer and relies on the infrastructure of your host. So what's very, very different about a virtual machine and a container is that the container doesn't have its own operating system. All it has is the application you need, like SQL Server, and any libraries that it depends on. That's what's inside the container. Then the container is hosted or managed by the Docker application, right? The Docker application is called the Docker engine. The Docker engine is installed on your computer, and you're just using one computer and one operating system, and all of that is on your host infrastructure. But your host is not responsible for managing the memory and everything used by the container. And then the other really nice thing is, with this one operating system and this one instance of Docker engine, you can have many containers, right? There obviously will be some kind of limitation, but the limitation is not 4. Maybe you've seen on Azure, you can have lots and lots of containers, and Docker will manage all of that. So if the one thing you can remember from this is that containers are not virtual machines, that's really, really important, but also understanding why they aren't. That big piece of information, which is they don't have a whole operating system in there, right? It's just the application you need and the libraries it depends on. So I want to talk about just so that not only to give you a technical understanding of Docker, but also to help you be able to talk to other people about it and understand, why do we always see that image with a container? So the idea with the ship, the container ship. So the idea is the Docker engine is that container ship, right? And then all of these Docker containers are all of the containers. So you can have a lot of containers. Docker engine just takes them and goes around and handles them. And then, of course, it got translated into the little whale. That's their logo, the little whale with all those little containers on them. So that's why we see the container and the ship all the time. I think also for me, it helps to have analogies. And another, besides the ship with the containers, another analogy for me is like having this adapter, right? This, or a power strip, right? We plug the power strip into the outlet in our building, so our house or our building. So our house has an infrastructure, and our house has an electrical system, right? And we plug it in with this to the house, and then we can plug all our containers into here. So this unit here is what's managing everything that's plugged into it. Another important thing to understand about Docker is that the Docker engine, the application itself, can be installed. You can run it all over the place. There's a Docker desktop application that can run on Mac, and it can run on Windows. That's what I have running on my Macintosh. This, I can't show it to you. PowerPoint's in full screen. Docker also is running on AWS and in Azure and Google Cloud. And you can also install it on your own server. So many different kinds of Linux servers and Windows servers. So Docker becomes this generic platform, and then anything you can put in a container, you can run in Docker and then run it anywhere you want. So I can have, as long as SQL Server for Linux is now possible to have in a container, now I can run it on a Macintosh. I don't need to have SQL Server for Windows in order to, I don't have to have Windows in order to run SQL Server anymore. So now what I want to do is, I'm going to skip Docker commands. I want to talk about the parts. I'll show you some commands later. I want to talk to you about the key pieces of Docker. So you saw me run the command docker run, and what I did was I said docker run. I fed in some environment variables and some parameters, but the most important other piece of information I gave it was this here. This is the name of an image. Okay, so what Docker does is it takes an image and then runs it as an instance. When it's running, it's called a container. So an image is a file, and a running instance is a container. So this is a Docker image. I have Docker images on my computer, managed by Docker. Because the Docker images exist on my computer, I can create containers for them. If I don't have them on my computer, I can get them from Docker. Going the wrong way. So how do you create a Docker image? A Docker image is defined by something called a Docker file. A Docker file is just a text file. And the text file has all the information Docker needs in order to build one of these images. So the image is actually a file that gets created. And we create it by telling Docker to read a Docker file, which has all this information in it. And then the Docker file, which is just a text file, can create the image. Once the image exists, then we can use Docker to say Docker run, and it will instantiate a container for the image. So to get to a Docker image from a Docker file, we use the command docker build. To get from a Docker image to a Docker container, we use the command docker run. That creates a running instance. This also was really hard for me to get my head around. And in case you're there, let me explain it in programmer terms. So Docker file is like a class definition, right? Docker image is like a binary form of a class. If you have your project, your .NET project, and you build it, you compile it, then you have the binary form of it. And then when you instantiate it, when you new up a class, new up an instance of a class and create an object, you have an object instance. That's what a Docker container is like. Now, I wish I could see your faces, or I wish I still had the YouTube channel up. That was making me super duper confused to see if there's any questions or if that helps make some sense of it.
No, don't have questions, and your explanation so clean.
Okay, great. So now what I want to do is I want to go to Docker. Well, it's not very good to show Google Hangouts on my computer, is it? I want to go to Docker Hub. Docker Hub is where there's a listing of public images that you can get. And as a matter of fact, anytime I use, except for images that I build myself, my own images, anytime I use an image, it's very likely that it's coming from like the original one of it is coming from Docker Hub. And we do something called pulling it. We pull it down from Docker Hub. So here's on Docker Hub, you can see some like this is sorted by the most popular images. Notice that some of these images are the official images, as opposed to if you went to hub.docker.com, Julie Lerman. Hey, I have some images on here. Is it just Docker.com to Julie Lerman? Docker Hub. I have to Google myself. Don't we all do that all the time? Oh, there it is. Right, so here's some images that I pushed up to the Docker Hub. These are not totally new. You know, these are just some experiments that I was doing. So you can have your own place on Docker Hub where you can put images also, or images that you've built. So I've created this one. I took the SQL Server image and I added some things to it and created my own image and uploaded that also. What I did was I created my own image, which was a combination of the SQL Server image, and then I also added a database in. So when you get this image, the database is already there. You don't have to, go find AdventureWorks and install it. So those are just mine. But notice that you have, I mean, there's thousands of them, but a database. Look how popular databases are. There's Couchbase. That's one of the most popular database images. So you can pull the Couchbase, on Docker, pull Couchbase down. I wonder how big it is. Maybe I could just do that. 10 million downloads. Let me show you. I should pick a really small one. I don't know how big that is going to be. Or we could just see how that works anyway. So here's what that looks like. I'm going to clear. So I'm going to say Docker pull Couchbase. Now, because I'm just saying Couchbase, like, how does it know where to get it from? By default, it will look on Docker Hub. Okay. And also, if you have Docker, a Docker repository installed on your server at work, you could have your Docker set up to point to there, so that you don't always have to define where to go get it. So my default Docker repository is the actual Docker Hub. So I'll hit enter and notice how it's pulling it down. I'm not going to wait for it to finish, but I want you to see a few things about this. One is, notice that it's being pulled down in many different segments. Okay. Some of that has to do with the different dependencies that the Couchbase image has. It's built from other images and Couchbase's logic. So that's one interesting thing. The other interesting thing is that as Couchbase version, as they move to another version or another version of this image, it won't need to, you won't need to pull all of the pieces yet, because most likely when they do some kind of an update, that will end up only changing a few of these pieces. So if I already have Couchbase installed and then I go and get an update, it might only need to pull down, 3 of these parts, right? So that's another interesting thing. So I have slow internet. I'm going to just crash that and say I don't really need Couchbase. What else do I want to show you? Oh, just looking around the Docker command line a little bit. So I'll clear this again. First of all, the Docker command line has a lot of commands. There's, you just typing Docker will give you some information about how to use Docker, how to use the commands. So there's a whole bunch of management commands, and then there's shortcuts. So I could, for example, say Docker image and then ls, that's the bash way to list files. Like it's like saying dir in Windows. So I could say docker image ls to list all the images that Docker is managing on my computer. I could say docker container ls. There's also shortcuts. I often use this shortcut for listing containers, docker ps. And for listing images, I just do docker images instead of docker image ls. So I actually have a lot of docker images on my running on my computer right now. They're not running containers. They're just being managed. They exist on my computers. And some of these are duplicates, lots of duplicates, because I'm doing all this stuff with ASP.NET and I don't clean things up. So I need to learn to do that. If I type docker ps, this is to list all of the running container instances on my computer, everything that's currently running. And the wrapping is a little hard to see, so I'm going to, I know it's getting smaller and smaller, but at least you can see one line there. So you can see I have 2 instances of the very same image running, right? You saw me start one of these. Oh, that's a good way to know how long I've been talking. You saw me start one of these a short while ago, right? So there's 2 instances of the same SQL Server. Imagine on your development machine, maybe you're working on a project that's been using SQL Server 2017, and you're in process of migrating it or preparing to migrate it to SQL Server 2019. You could have multiple containers of the different versions running at the same time, right? So another interesting thing to see is I might have some containers that I was running, but I stopped running them, but I didn't clean them up. So I'm going to use this. That's to show hidden. That's just a bash command to show anything hidden. And I can see that there is nothing hidden. So that's nice. So I'm going to show you let me think for a moment. I think I know what I want to do. I want to show you on the SQL Server image. Let me go back here. It doesn't need to be the SQL Server image. I'm going to go look at the Mongo image. And what I'm looking for is its Docker file. If I was on the SQL Server one, I would know where to find it. I just randomly grabbed this because it should be on GitHub. Oh, maybe if I just click on one of these things. Okay. Docker file links. So I just want to show you what a Docker file looks like. And remember, a Docker file is what you use to define what goes into an image when Docker builds the image for you. So here, for example, is a Docker file for, actually, I really would like to have SQL Server, GitHub, MS SQL Docker. Oh, here it is. Yay, a familiar one that I'm used to working with. Okay, so here's the Docker file that's used to build the MS SQL Server Linux image. Okay, so the first thing that's in here, that's actual code, these are just comments, is this from. And that's just saying, what is the base layer of this going to be of this image? So this is referencing another image. So that's an image that's also on Docker. And all it means is before you start, the first thing I want you to do when you start building this image is go get this image, because I'm going to build my image on top of Ubuntu. Then the next thing, it has some commands, commands that are going to apply to the image. So make sure that when you build the image, that it exposes this on port 1433. Then what we don't see is all the files that will be going into it. That's not open source, right? Microsoft is the one who will run this. But in their build machines, there's an install folder that has all the folders, all the files that need to go into the image. And then the other thing is, this happens to be, now, Docker files can have all kinds of commands in them. This is just one example, and it's pretty simple. But what this is also saying is when you run this, whenever this image is instantiated, when anybody takes this image and says, okay, run the image, then what it will do is after it starts it up, after it instantiates the image, then it's going to call whatever this command is. And what's in this command not only is it's going to actually run the SQL Server engine itself, but also it has a whole bunch of T-SQL script that it runs to set up its system files and master files and everything. As a matter of fact, if I go back over to Azure Data Studio, I can show you, right, when I ran that SQL Server file, it created all of this. So these things weren't already installed into the database server. The database server wasn't running on the image, right? It's just the files. So the image starts running the container, it starts up the SQL server.exe, and then it ran some scripts, SQL scripts that were there, and the SQL scripts created all of this stuff for you. Also, just in case you're not familiar with this, I happen to be using Azure Data Studio, which is cross-platform. So I'm using it on my Mac to look at SQL Server databases. So SQL Server is just one example of an existing image. This is an official image from Microsoft. There's also ASP.NET Core.
Julie?
Yes?
Can I make a baby question? A baby question. It's important to persist the data in containers, in Docker.
Yes, that's a really good question. That's a really good question about persisting data and, data persistence in containers. And that's especially unnerving because I happen to be talking about SQL Server right now. So there's a concept called volumes. It's almost like another container. And what you can do is you can define separate volumes where your persisted data would go. And then your container can point to that, knows how to connect to that volume. So does that, so that's if you really want to persist for example, for production. And people are using SQL Server in containers in production. But for persistence, all the data is persisted in a volume. And the interesting thing is you can shut down the container, but leave the volume running. As a matter of fact, I might have some volumes running on this computer. Hey, go away, go away. Command plus Docker volume, because I forget they're here and I don't shut them down. Yes, I have a Docker volume. So what's interesting is, and this is part of Docker, what's interesting is I can leave this volume here even if I shut down the container that's running SQL Server. Imagine doing that in automated testing or something like that, because the SQL Server container, that's a pretty big container. It takes a lot of resources. So you can spin it up, do the thing you want to do, and then shut it down, but you can leave this volume here if you want. Or it's another way you can share things with people, share information around with people. So there's all kinds of things you can do with volumes. So you don't have to persist your data inside the container. In the case of these servers that I'm created here, everything's all the databases are inside the same container where the server is, because I didn't set it up with a volume. Now, if you're doing testing, like QA and testing and things like that, it might make sense to have the data inside the container, because you're just going to spin it up, do some testing, and then get rid of it. So you don't really need, that's a scenario where you might not really need to persist the data. So there's no need to have a different volume. So there's all kinds of other, we're in GitHub now. Oh, now there's Mongo. There's all kinds of other containers, and I just wanted to mention there also are containers for ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core, I mean. And I want to show you a little bit of that, and then I'm going to show you some code. So if I went to, please tell me I have, oh, there's .NET Core. No, I want the .NET Core GitHub ASP.NET. I was on there today. Let me think. Docker MS SQL .NET. Here we go. So let's see if this points to them. So here's the GitHub repository for the Docker files, the Docker containers for ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core and the .NET Core SDK and the ASP.NET Core, the .NET Core runtime. So there's all these different Docker files. Now, these are not the images. These are just the Docker files that build those images. So here's just another example. This is a very different kind of a Docker file, though. I don't even, oh, here, this one is from, right? From is what is the base of this? And this is saying I've got a base image for a different version, different base image of ASP.NET Core, and then, or is that .NET? This is just the .NET runtime. And this is saying to go ahead and it's installing the newer version on top of it or something. I am trying to read that really quickly. But this again, this is used to build a specific image. Another thing about those images, let me just go to, let's see, Docker Hub. Okay. Another thing I want to point out about images, and you might have noticed this when I showed the Docker PS, the containers. Notice this image. It's SQL Server : 2017-latest. So this is the base image, but what they do, what you can do is create variations on an image. So we might have MS SQL Server 2019, right? Or various versions of 2017. So this one's called 2017 latest. Let me see what I have here. So here's the Docker Hub for Microsoft .NET Core ASP.NET, right? And here you can see the current one. This has the tag 2.2. This one has the tag 2.1. So a tag, it's not necessarily like a version, the way we go from, well, in this case, that's a version 2.1, 2.2, like incrementing new features, something, implementing new features. But notice that we have different tags down here. So for example, here's this, let me try and make this bigger.
Julie, we have a
Yes.
question.
Yes.
We have on chat a question. Alex Busco. Alex told us about Docker. Like you said, people are using database on Docker at production. In your opinion, why it's better to use Docker to run the database instead of installing it directly on the server? I know in Dev it helps you to jump between investors easily, but in production, what could I say to someone to convince him to change to Docker? Do you understand?
Oh, let me just slide up to, let me open a different presentation here.
If you have a question, I will you pass.
No, I'm answering the question.
Okay, thanks.
Here is one really good reason for using Docker. Now, I'm not talking about production. Right now, for Docker, for a database, that was the question, right? Docker database. This is about using it in testing and development and being able to share. Sorry, taking a drink of water. Being able to share, you could include a Docker file along with your code and share it in GitHub, and then everybody can just pull down the image that they need. You don't have to have everybody, we're updating to the new version of SQL Server. Everybody has to install SQL Server now, right? Nobody has to go and install SQL Server. So now they can just use Docker to automatically get, very quickly get SQL Server on their computer. And they don't even have to go and, install, like say Docker pull SQL Server. They don't have to do that at all. For example, so now I'm opened up an ASP.NET Core application in Visual Studio Code. And I want you to notice I have a Docker file here. But I also have something called Docker Compose. And I don't want to get too deeply into it, but just with respect to the question, all of this code can be, contained together. Like here's all the code for my application, but I also have these Docker files. And one of the instructions in the Docker file is to go and get the SQL Server image. So imagine a new developer comes onto the team and all they have to do is just go pull this from your shared source control repository. And then when they run this application, this Docker instruction will go ahead and make sure that SQL Server, the correct version that you want. So you could, say 2017 or use the proper tags, but that will just automatically be there. Is that enough so I can show a few more things with our time?
Falar negócio pra você.
Diga.
Calma.
É bronca.
fácil de assustada.
É bronca.
Actually, as long as I'm here,
É porque eu nunca te liguei. Pode ser.
as long as I'm here,
Quando
can
tiver.
I just stay in?
Ó, é
Are we okay? Can I keep talking?
Yes, Julie, go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right. So, all right. So we looked at a couple of different Docker files. And now I do want to show you a little more about this application that is an ASP.NET Core API application that just does a few little things. It uses Entity Framework. And let me see. Let me just make sure what the app settings are and that I have. Just make sure this is still running. Yes, this is still running. Okay. So this is just a little project, and I'm just going to run this. First, I'm going to run it in a way that has nothing to do with Docker, kind of. Just running the app itself. Although, I just want to point out that the database that it's using is one of these database instances that I have running here. It's this one right here. So this is running inside of a Docker container, and my application is not running in Docker. It's just running on Metal, but it's using data from the database. So I'm just .NET Run. Okay, now that's running at localhost 5000. And here's my controller. My controller is called humans, and it just returns a little bit of data. Right? That's all the controller is. So the controller is just on my computer, and the code, everything is just on my computer, but the SQL Server database is in a container so far. So what I want to do now is I want to create an image from my application. That means I'm going to have two separate images. I'm going to have one image and then and run that as a container that is my application, my ASP.NET Core API application. And I'll have a separate image and container that are the SQL Server database. So they're two separate things, but they'll both be running, like this. Boop, 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 right? So in this case, there'll just be two, right? So this is my computer host infrastructure. I have Mac OS installed on it. I have Docker Engine installed on top of that. And then I'm going to have one container will be the SQL Server container, and the other container will be the container that has my application in it. So that's what I'm aiming for. So that's just the connection string for my application. So what I've done is, let me just close some of these things. Let me just close all these things. So I have here a Docker file. This is my Docker file that I created. I created it inside of my application here. And I had some help. I had help creating it because I'm using a Docker extension in Visual Studio Code, and I was able to hit F1 and type Docker and see all the Docker commands and add Docker files to Workspace. So after I had already built the application, it used a template to create this Docker file for me. I did a couple of tweaks to the Docker file because I'm using, as you can see, unreleased stuff from ASP.NET Core, like the new stuff. I was just experimenting. So what this Docker file says, and this is a little more complicated than the one I showed you for SQL Server. It does a few things. First, it says, I want you to begin with this, go get this image. mcr.microsoft.com. Now, what this means, why is this not just saying ASP.NET Core so that it knows to go to Docker Hub? That's because Microsoft has created its own repository to host its images. You can still see some of them on Docker Hub, so that's just like a good discoverable pointer. But now they're hosted on their own repository, Microsoft Container Repository. That's what MCR stands for. So this is just saying, go get this image, from .NET Core, ASP.NET, and the tag of the image is 3.00 preview 6. And name that. I want you, Docker, on my Julie's computer to think of that as base. That's its name. I want to call it base. It sets up defines a working directory and says when you build this one here, when you build and create a container, I want you to expose this working directory. Then it says, now I need a build image. So I want to get the SDK. So it's pulling another image, and it's defining a work directory from that. And into there, remember, it's what's the base image, and then what are the other instructions? These are all the things that are going to happen when I build this Docker file. So it's going to start by getting this, then it's going to get this and create a new image. Matter of fact, what's happening is this is called a multi-tier build. So it's going to start by that's going to first build an image called base. Then it's going to build an image called build. And then it's going to copy all of my application files in there. Where is it finding them? Well, they're right here in the same folder along with the Docker file. So make sure you copy in the CS proj file. Make sure then you go ahead and run .NET Build on it. So that's the second tier. Then when it's finished building, it's going to take this image that it just built and rebuild it again. And then publish it. And then create in a Docker container, in another Docker image, it's going to publish the application into a Docker image. And what's cool about that is once it's published, it no longer needs the SDK in there. It's already built, so we don't need all this extra stuff inside of there. So the image, this third image that's built, doesn't have the SDK in there. It only has the runtime in there. And then it takes it one more time and creates the last smallest and most complete version of the image, but it only has what it needs to run the application and the runtime. It takes it out of the publish image and then says, whenever you run this image, whenever you create a container from this image, you have to call .NET and run it against the core API assembly. So this is a little more complicated. It's a multi-tier build. And then what it does is it ends up with a more efficient and smaller image at the end. And then it knows that when you run a container from that final one, what should happen when you run that container. And so it's going to essentially do what I did and say .NET run as soon as it's run. So there are two things you can do here. You can build the image, go ahead and build the image. Let me make sure. I've got so many images in here. Let me just this is called Core API. So I'm going to get rid of the last one I built. So it doesn't exist anymore. So also, this is the Docker extension again. It has all kinds of wonderful features inside of Visual Studio Code. I find this a lot easier to look at than going to the command line and typing Docker images and Docker PS and Docker PSA to see everything that's going. So I can see there's two containers running. See that? Those are the two SQL Server containers that are running. So I'm going to go ahead and build. I won't run, but I'll build the image that represents my application, my ASP.NET Core application. And it's just going to ask me a couple of questions. And then it goes ahead and builds. And I can see what it's doing in terms of following the different steps that are defined inside of the Docker file. So if we scroll up, right, the first thing it did, step 1, was to go and make sure that I have this image already on my machine. I already had it, so it didn't have to pull it down. If I didn't have it yet, the first thing it would do is Docker pull that image, and then it can start building. So then it's doing all the different steps. Here it's running .NET Restore, right? So it's getting all of the NuGet packages that need to be inside the image in order to run the application. Here's where it's running .NET Build, right? And it says build succeeded with no warnings. Here's where it's creating another container. I mean, it's creating another image. So it's trimming it down without the SDK in it and creating a published version inside that image. Doing restoring. Step 16, it's creating the entry point. So the image now has been built. There it is, Core API. Okay. Now, I don't know if you remember when I ran the application before. This is a really important thing to understand. And again, I'm just trying to get you exposed to these ideas. You don't have to, don't worry if you don't feel like you're an expert after this. That's not my goal. My goal is just to give you enough of an understanding that you feel comfortable playing with it and now learning more about it. So this when I ran the application on Metal and it was using the SQL Server database, not launch settings, I'm sorry, I want to be in app settings. I had this connection defined, okay? So that means look for the server on the local host of the computer. So when I was running my ASP.NET API on Metal on my computer, my computer knows what local host is. But if I now run this application inside of a container, then it would expect local host to also be inside of that same container. Okay, so that's my container that's running the ASP.NET Core API doesn't have SQL Server inside of it. SQL Server is in another container outside of it. So when you want to have containers interacting with each other, that's called orchestration. And you may have heard that phrase, container orchestration. And there's a well-known tool that automates container orchestration you may have heard of. It's called Kubernetes. I'm going to just show you the Kubernetes. Okay, so Kubernetes is another application, and Kubernetes runs in Azure. Azure has Azure Kubernetes Service. Docker Enterprise has Kubernetes. So if you're running Docker Enterprise on your server, you have Kubernetes to orchestrate multiple containers. And so you can use it for testing, you can use it for production, all these different ways of using Kubernetes. Now, I'm not going to use Kubernetes, but I just wanted you to understand when I'm talking about container orchestration, in order to orchestrate multiple containers that need to talk to each other. That's a really common thing that happens with Kubernetes. But I'm going to do orchestration in a different way for my test environment. And the way I'm going to do that is with part of Docker that's called Docker Compose. And Docker Compose lets me define how to compose multiple containers. So what this is going to do for me is, with Docker Compose, it allows me to set up kind of a listing for building and building images and then running them as containers all at the same time. So it's important still to have the Docker file. So here's my Docker file still for my ASP.NET Web API. So in this Docker Compose, I'm defining 2 containers that I want to exist. So they're called services in here. So the first one is my API, and notice I'm telling it you can find a Docker file and its name is Docker file. So there are the instructions for building this API, right? And then all the rest of everything it needs to know is inside of that Docker file. The other thing I'm telling it, and there are many parameters you can define in here. So this is for an important parameter is saying, what is the name of the image you want to create, right? So I'm going to create, it's going to create an image, and then it's going to use this Docker file in order to know how to create the image. And also it's important that I know when I run the image that it should be exposed. My ASP.NET Core API should be exposed on port 80 of the machine that's hosting it. So that's one service I'm defining. So when I run this composition, it's going to look for Docker file, figure out what needs to happen, and then it's going to create my image for me to contain my ASP.NET Core API, and it's going to name it whatever this registry is, and then the word API after it. As a matter of fact, I probably have one sitting around here. No, but I'm going to get rid of this one again so it's not confusing. So here's the second container I want. I've said the name of this service is called DB. I want you to use this image. It already exists. I'm not giving it a Docker file. I'm just saying this image already exists. If it's on my computer, Docker is already managing it on my computer, great. You don't have to do anything hard. If you can't find it inside of my Docker repository on my computer, then go to this resource and go ahead and pull it for me. So that's just saying what the image is, but I don't have to build it. So that's why I don't have a build section. There's no build section, so I don't have to do anything about building it. The rest of the information is about running it. So when I run it, it needs environment variables. I don't know if you remember seeing that when I ran this, I passed in this accept EULA environment variable and this password environment variable. That's required for the SQL Server container when you're running a container. So that's why I'm passing these in here also. And then I'm also saying what port to expose it on. I'm going to remove these so you can see that I'm really creating these from scratch. So those containers are gone. The image is still there to build it from, but the running instances are no longer in existence. So when I run it, I want to expose it on port 1601. But remember this whole question I brought up about localhost. So this is some magic that Docker will do for me. Notice this name that I'm giving this service. I can use that DB. I'm calling it DB just randomly. I could call it foo. But now I can use that as the server name. I'm going to change the server name here to DB. That means when I'm running my ASP.NET Core API inside of its own container, because Docker Compose is going to be responsible for spinning all this up, the ASP.NET Core container will know where this DB server is, that it's in this other container. So I'm going to go ahead and run all of this stuff now. And the Docker extension lets me do it easily. I'm just going to say Docker Compose up. So it's building it. There's a lot happening here. So it started by building the Docker Compose, but the first thing it knew it needed to do was build my ASP.NET Core image. So here are all the steps that are happening that are instructions from inside of the Docker file. We saw those happen before. There were 16 of them. So it did all of that stuff again. That was all that it did for that one, right? All the way through 16 steps. So that was finished, and now it built the image. That's this line here, successfully built it, and it gave it an ID. Then it gave it a name, API latest, and then it created. This is where it's actually creating the instances. This is running the container. So from success, the word successfully above, that was building the ASP.NET Core image. It doesn't need to build the DB image because that is just from the SQL Server image. So it already had that. So it built the other image, and we can see, we should see, oh, there it is, API. There's the image that it just built. But it's also, notice, it's now running these two containers, right? That was the last two instructions. So now I have my SQL Server container running again. It's still exposed at port 1601 on my computer, so I can still see it from my computer. If I refresh this, okay, it's still there on my computer. But now, because I'm using DB as a server name in the connection string that my API is using, when I'm going to browse to the API now, remember I said I'm exposing it on port 80. So it's localhost port 80. And since that's the default, hey, that didn't work out well. Try typing again. Localhost 80 / API human. Okay, so that's going to go inside of the container now that's running my ASP.NET Core application. Then that container is going to talk to the container that has the SQL Server database in it. Now, the first thing it has to do, though, is it's creating and seeding my new database, because I have code inside of my application. My entity framework code, right, is going to initialize the database and seed it. And it just finished happening. And so now there it is running. So that's the this application now is running inside of a Docker container, and it's talking to the separate container. And but we can also still look at the SQL Server container from outside as well. So if I refresh this, there's the new database that got created. There's the table that got created. And there's the same data. There's the same data, Romeo and Juliet. So looking at the time, that's about the time, enough time. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to say. And I'm just going to, this isn't the one. Wrong presentation. Well, I talked about Dockerfile and Docker Compose. I talked about Kubernetes. There was something else I wanted to point out. I wanted to just talk about this for a moment, which is that you can use Docker containers for a long running app, which is kind of what we just looked at, right? I would imagine if you have a website or a web API, that's going to be running for a long time. Or maybe a short running application. For example, you might just want to run SQL Server for a little while to do some testing or something. But you can also use it to just do particular tasks. For example, I've created containers that run integration tests. So the lifetime of that container is only long enough to start up, run the tests, log the results of the tests, and then stop. So it's just for one thing, right? You can run something really quickly. I've seen uses of containers to run a couple of PowerShell commands on Azure or something like that. So it is interesting because if the Docker engine already exists, you don't have to worry about installing other software in order to run some tasks or like a Windows service or something like that. You could actually run that service inside of a container. So just, spin up the container, and then the container knows, based on how you define the image in Docker file, the container will know once it's running, it needs to just run some commands. And then when it's completed the commands, it will automatically shut down. So it's really interesting to consider that possibility. Now, something like SQL Server, that actually happens to be a big image because it's a big application, right? But you could also have tiny little images, and so they don't seem as cumbersome in your application. So I think that's, for me, enough. And I hope it's satisfying as well for those of you who've been watching. I wanted to see if I could get back onto the YouTube to see if there were questions. I'm doing that on a different computer now. Okay.
The people was talking about using production or just for development.
Yes, instead of, it takes care of a lot of the infrastructure. Thank you for writing these questions and comments in English. Most of them I can actually read, though. And it looks like there's some people on here who are pretty good at Docker already. I can tell by the way they're answering some of these questions. I'm seeing some troll questions about Microsoft Windows. Like you said, people are using databases on Docker. Okay, we talked about that. Oh, yes, with Docker, you can reboot settings quickly. Just drop the image and raise. Okay, we're talking about the volumes again. And now you can run Linux on Windows. Oh my gosh, yes, it's so true. It's like everything's blending together now. So Alex, thanks for all of your help answering questions. Blah, blah, blah. I'm just still reading. I consider Docker as an environment builder. There's no reason to persist data inside if you have better solutions to make it. Yeah. I think that question again about persisting data inside of a container. I think if it's, if you're testing, doing automated testing, that actually makes sense. Why create another volume for it if you're just going to throw away the data anyway? Throw away the container and the data. You might as well just put them all together and get rid of them all together. But if you do want to persist it, volumes are definitely the way to go. And that's not just for SQL Server data. There's all kinds of reasons. Maybe remember I said something about log files, right? So maybe you want to spit log files out into a volume so you can access them from something else another time or something like that. So that looks like all of it for the questions. So I know it's a little weird doing this all online and not being able to see people's faces, and I use my hands a lot when I I use my hands to explain things, so I wasn't able to have my hands help you understand me better tonight. But yeah, that should be it. And I can give you this presentation, but there's also, I've written a whole bunch of articles in MSDN magazine about Docker recently, and I just did one today, as a matter of fact, also. So, for example, the last 3 articles I wrote were about Docker EF core in a Docker ASP.NET, in a Docker container, using it in like an ASP.NET Core application in Docker containers. So there's 3 articles right there where I did that. And I've talked about Docker, mostly Docker with SQL Server, because this is a data column. But I've talked about Docker and SQL Server and volumes also in earlier articles. I'm just scrolling down to try to look for that. Oh, I know, it's July. There, like this one. And this one I talked a little bit about volumes also. And there's all kinds of wonderful resources. And if you've never used Docker, another interesting resource, I had it at the end of, it's gone now. The other presentation is gone. Actually, that's where I had some resources. Come on. Oh, here we go.
Oh, goodness.
So this is some of my this is some of my articles, but also one of the things I found for volumes that I found to really help me get my aha moment with volumes was this Kata Coda walkthrough. That's at the bottom of the list there, Kata Coda. All the courses on Kata Coda are their walkthroughs. All the labs are inside of Docker containers, so they're real Docker experts. And then when they have their walkthroughs about Docker information, they're extra good. So that I found was a pretty good resource.
Julie, we have another question from Marcelo Maia. Marcelo Maia told us, Julie, do you like most Windows or Linux?
Oh my God.
Well, I like them both. Although I'm using Mac OS, so I've never actually, oh, that's not true. I've hardly ever used Linux. I've used it only just to see what it looked like, just out of curiosity. I've been using Windows ever since Windows existed, and I used DOS before that. I only started using Macintosh. I use both right now, but I started using Macintosh when .NET Core was coming out. And the first time I saw somebody from the Entity Framework team using Entity Framework Core on a MacBook, I said, I should get a MacBook and see how that works. So I think, I know it was just kind of a joke question, but
Yes.
I love both. I mean, Windows is Windows is Windows. It's like my whole life is on Windows. For me, MacBook also, it's just fun to use Macintosh for me because they used Windows for so long.
Yes.
So
Okay.
there's a long answer to a silly question.
Yes. Another question When you started to open after Docker, you using the terminal because terminal is cited in macOS. If you using Windows, what tool do you use?
Oh, it's just the same. I mean, I use the Docker commands. I use Docker on Windows all the time. There's a Docker, the Docker engine, the Docker application has a Windows version, so I have that all the time. And when I open up the console, I just type the same Docker commands. It's the Docker command line. So it's not Bash, it's just the Docker command line. So I can use the Docker command line, you know, on Windows or in Mac terminal, because it's cross-platform.
Amazing. Thanks.
Okay, no more questions?
No more questions. I have a question for Julie.
Do you have a question, Jocelyn?
No, I have the presentation of food is perfect. It's amazing. I understood everything.
Okay. Julie, thank you for accepting our invite. Thank you for helping Brazilian community. I know that you love Brazilian people. It's a pleasure meeting you sometimes. And I would like to see you in Brazil, son.
I hope to come to Brazil soon. Well, not super soon. I don't have plans to come very, very soon, but I definitely want to come back to Brazil. Absolutely. It was so beautiful to be there. And my visa is still good through 2026, right? It was a 10-year visa.
Oh, nice. And if in the future we can have another meeting like this, it's a pleasure for us. We will keep talking about it. And that's all.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. It was an honor and a pleasure. And if we do it again, I'll be more intelligent about this, how the screen sharing works and the Google and the YouTube and the 10-second delay. I was a little confused about that at first, for sure.
No problem.
All right. Well, have a good night, everybody.
Good night. Let me ask for...
We finish. Pessoal, muito obrigado pela presença aí, todo mundo. Quem puder deixar o like, deixa o like. Tem 11 pessoas assistindo aí. Deixa o like no vídeo aí. Se inscreve no canal. Logo teremos mais lives como essa. Obrigado.
Bye.
Bye. Obrigado. Yes, Julie. Marivo, can you finish the